It is often said that history rhymes. This is told as a cautionary phrase when the world seems to be slipping into lapses of fascism, authoritarianism, and other such calamitous situations that seem cynically reminiscent of the past. Yet it can be equally applicable as a literal summary of our late capitalist times, as we observe time blend pervasively in an anachronistic fashion, where objects, persons, and norms are misplaced in time. Now, we say the term late capitalism a lot, but what is it really? Ernest Mandel, one of the pioneers of this concept, used the term to define the state of our economic system after the Second World War. He characterized it by globalization, a rise in financial capital, the rapid rates of technological replacement, a stronger state that would impinge on democratic liberties, and uneven levels of profit accumulation, specifically to the West's benefit. This is in contrast to his previous stages of capitalism, which Mandel distinguished to be freely competitive capitalist production, existent from 1700 to 1870, which encompassed the growth of domestic markets across Western Europe and North America, and monopoly capitalism, existent from 1870 to 1940, which encompassed imperialist competition for international markets, featuring spheres of influence wherein each great power had their respective colonies which they exported capital to and exploited. Fredric Jameson very famously affixed a cultural aspect to this term in his 1989 book, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. He argued that postmodernism corresponds to the fast, globalized, financialized nature of late capitalism. And the characteristics that he identified in his analysis that are helpful include the mediation of a full commodification of life, the depthless value of surfaces over human emotion, and the rise of remix due to a need for instant gratification. While social scientists believe the global economic system has begun to mutate again, the future remains very much debated, and it is still a meaningful framework present in many cultural analyses. A simple answer to the rise of nostalgia is merely that quality of life was better in the past, but this is only partially true. Firstly, material conditions have become objectively better. Global poverty, child mortality, and infectious disease rates are at historic lows. Access to education, rights, and medicine have also had drastic improvements compared to previous generations. Moreover, the good old days were only better for specific demographic groups. People of color, women, the queer community, and other marginalized groups often lacked equal rights, workplace protections, and social freedom, yet they have also fallen prey to nostalgia. It is important to recognize that today's crisis cannot be explained by economic circumstances alone. Thus, one of the defining features of late capitalism is this crisis of temporality, as displayed by Jameson's characteristics of postmodernism. The waning of historicity has become almost integral to the modern experience. Do you often feel that even though the years pass, nothing actually changes? One year just blurs the next, and we are filled with nothing but indifference towards time and a desire to live for the moment and the almost utopian yesteryear. An anecdotal trend that reminded me of this was when 2026 began, people online joked that it was 2016. While this was an unserious social media fad, it was simultaneously a very real yearning indicative of this social condition. In fact, the contemporary experience feels as if the future no longer even exists, at least not in an experimentative, imaginative way. People of the 20th century, when asked about the future, expected to see flying cars, automated domestic servants, and gleaming megacities filled with smart homes. If you ask people today what the future would look like, they would probably say something similar, but the crucial difference is that back then, these concepts were actually futuristic. Nowadays, these technologies are very much possible to be realized, and scientists are actively working on bringing them to life. An interesting manifestation of this paradox, where the future is no longer a temporal concept but almost a style, is how we will say things like X country is living in the future, often being Japan, or this is the future of X industry. This is a strange use of the term because the future definitionally cannot exist now. It is often said that capitalism breeds innovation, but in many ways it is a stagnant ideology, at least in its late form. In Mark Fisher's book Ghosts of My Life, his first chapter, The Slow Cancellation of the Future, discusses this exact phenomenon. He writes that the 21st century is oppressed by a crushing sense of finitude and exhaustion. Or, alternatively, it doesn't feel as if the 21st century has started yet. We remain trapped in the 20th century. Essentially, Fisher argues that 21st century culture is constantly caught in remix and transformations of the past. His observations do not concern the disappearance of a particular object. What has vanished is a tendency of virtual trajectory. In other words, the object is the literal work. He does not argue that no original characters, texts, or other cultural objects are created in the 21st century. Instead, he is mourning the disappearance of a trajectory, or a cultural momentum that used to push society towards experimental, creative, forward-looking thinking. Fisher develops this thesis primarily through examples from film and music. Ghosts of My Life was published over a decade ago, but more recent cultural trends only reinforce his diagnosis. Observing the top 10 grossing films of 2025, they were Nausea 2, Zootopia 2, Avatar Fire and Ash, Lilo and Stitch, a Minecraft movie, Jurassic World Rebirth, Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba Infinity Castle, How to Train Your Dragon, F1, and Superman. Here, Fisher's theory presents itself starkly, because no single one of these films is built on an original concept. 5 were sequels, 2 were developed from existing franchises, 2 were live-action remakes, and 1 was a reboot. All of these films are either direct remixes of artworks from the 20th century or earlier, or are remixes of artworks from the 21st century but inspired by cultural forms of the 20th. Regarding this latter point, for instance, Zootopia 1 was an animal adaptation of The Three Musketeers, a story from 1960. More generally, most blockbusters nowadays are following the similar formula for Hollywood filmmaking since the 1990s, the hero's journey structure, which explains why we can almost always predict endings to films nowadays. But we can also use music as an example of this thesis. Sabrina Carpenter exemplifies this tendency particularly well. Her aesthetic is constructed almost entirely of retro-visual and musical references. Sabrina's album last year resembles 1970s and 1980s disco pop, with House Tour directly interpolating the 1985 synth-funk classic In My House by the Mary Jane Girls, and the album covers including a vintage filter over the Man-Child single cover and Marilyn Monroe recreations. Not to mention how her short and sweet tour was filled with iconic homages, such as late-night talk show-style commercial interludes and 1960s-inspired outfits and hairstyles. But Sabrina is not the only example of this. Lana Del Rey performs this same pastiche arguably even better. She seamlessly blends nostalgic aura, lyrical references, and cinematic tropes from the 20th century. The imagery associated with her music, rainy camcorder footage, flower fields, vintage summer dresses, faded Americana, illustrates Fisher's point that contemporary culture increasingly recycles established historical signifiers. I think the albums Lust for Life, Ultraviolence, and Chemtrails Over the Country Club really epitomize this. Furthermore, just as there is often a formula for film, popular music has likewise become standardized, with songs optimized for streaming and virality. For instance, most songs are between 2 minutes and 2:45 in order to maintain engagement, and they often involve a 4-chord progression which is psychologically satisfying for the listener. Film and music are not the only examples of this phenomenon. Fisher is concerning the realm of imagination in general. Consider the constant obsession with recreating past looks in fashion, the use of low-quality camera filters in editing, as well as modern technology mimicking sci-fi concepts from the past, such as Elon Musk claiming his inspiration for Neuralink being the neural lace from Ian M. Banks' novel series The Culture. The emergence of generative AI may intensify this occurrence, given that they are fundamentally trained to replicate existing works. And as Fisher writes, anachronism has led to stasis. Time has stopped. As new cultural movements recycle the past, a clear boundary of now is lost. Society becomes obsessed with old ideas instead of new ones, and these aesthetic updates mask a fundamental lack of social and intellectual growth within present-day society. Things aren't old anymore, they're just high art or vintage. Now, I want to emphasize that remixing the past has always existed, but previously, it existed alongside strong senses of historical movement and novelty. So in the past, art involved recreation in the sense that they reacted to each other, their progression being a dialogue between eras of sorts. Romanticism reacted to the Enlightenment, Impressionism reacted to Realism, etc. Even when artists explicitly drew upon the past, they generally did so through engagement with a relatively coherent tradition. However, a contemporary artist might combine 17th century Dutch painting techniques with 1930s cartoon aesthetics and 2000s futurism. Note the examples I mentioned previously. Noja 2 reimagines a Shang Dynasty adaptation of ancient mythology through digital 3D animation, with characters aesthetically styled to modern Chinese beauty standards, while Lana Del Rey's music fuses old Hollywood glamour, mid-century Americana, contemporary pop production, and I would argue even some 19th century romanticism. Rather than engaging with one coherent historical tradition, such works are assembling fragments from disparate eras into these simultaneous aesthetic experiences. The issue then is not so much that contemporary culture just references the past, but that reference is increasingly substituting evolution. But why is culture today so riddled with this anachronism? As Fisher famously argued in his other book, Capitalist Realism, following the fall of communism and the rise of neoliberalism, we live in a pervasive atmosphere where it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Therefore, the most straightforward answer is that capitalism, by only rewarding products that produce profit, disincentivizes the risk-taking that existed when being daring was still acceptable, when money wasn't everything, because there were adequate social safety nets that allowed room for failure. He writes in the slow cancellation of the future that neoliberal capitalism has gradually but systematically deprived artists of the resources necessary to produce the new. There is an increased tendency to turn out cultural productions that resemble what was already successful. This reflects this mature dynamic of late capitalism, a system that is increasingly dependent on the continual recombination of already profitable forms. Even if most artists are not actively operating under the guise of revenue, this argument is less about individual decisions than it is about a cultural shift caused by values and conditions. Another way in which late capitalism has bred sluggishness is how it is a highly destabilizing mode of living. Could it be that neoliberal capitalism's destruction of solidarity and security brought about compensatory hungering for the well-established and the familiar? The intensity and precariousness of late capitalist work culture leaves people in a state where they are simultaneously exhausted and overstimulated. The combination of precarious work and digital communications lead to a besieging of attention. In this insomniac, inundated state, Berardi claims culture becomes de-eroticized. Like another of Berardi's claims, pornography, retro offers the quick and easy promise of a minimal variation on an already familiar satisfaction. Thus, nostalgia can be understood as a kind of therapy for the laborer. It is mobilized by capitalism to make the draining reality under the system palatable. Cultural conditions alone do not explain political outcomes. If late capitalism encourages nostalgia as an automatic way of thinking, the next question is why this nostalgia has become such a powerful source of political mobilization. If late capitalism is characterized by the commodification of everyday life, then one of its most profound consequences may be the commodification of time itself. Gary Cross, in his book Consume Nostalgia, argues that not only is the past a siren song for those troubled by the modern era, but its commodified nature depoliticizes it. Nostalgia is no longer a deep longing for historical heritage, but products from the past. This has the effect of almost forgiving the rapid nature of late capitalism for creating disquietness. Chrostowska writes similarly in her paper Consumed by Nostalgia that under capitalism, nostalgia reproduces rapidly through the channels of symbolic economy, the opportunities that accompany consumer capitalism, to construct our identity by sharing or giving access to personal history representing some significant privileged connection with the past, in case the link corrodes or the chain linking the past in collective memory loses its hold on the imagination. These same opportunities excoriate the remembrance, and with it the things remembered, their autonomous life in our memory, beyond any justification and benefit. In layman's terms, modern consumer culture treats our personal memories and history as products to be shared and consumed, which ultimately destroys the true deep meaning of these moments. Interestingly, this connects to what Walter Benjamin wrote regarding art in his seminal essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Essentially, his thesis is that as art has become increasingly reproduced in the age of mechanical reproduction, especially under capitalist needs for efficiency, art loses its aura, or its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. To build this argument, he distinguished between two values of art. First is cult or ritual value, which was art's main value prior to this revolution. The cult value of an artwork lay in its physical existence and sacred significance, rather than being viewed by the masses. They were often hidden or restricted, such as hidden Madonnas or remote temple statues, to maintain their magical, mysterious authority. This form of art is defined by its aura, but reproduction transformed the value of art to exhibition value. The value of art now is in its ability to be seen, circulated, and replicated, the most notable example being film. Instead of residing in a church or private collection, art is displayed globally in galleries, phone screens, and movie theaters. But the mass availability of replicas strips the object of its aura, since it can be omnipresent. Importantly, Benjamin noted that this shift from cult value to exhibition value changes the very nature of art itself. Mass-produced art puts the public in a state of distraction, playing the role of a mass critic rather than a reverent observer. In a similar sense, nostalgia has lost its aura under capitalism. The term nostalgia was originally coined by a Swiss medical student, Johannes Hofer, in 1688, and it was a medical term to describe the affliction tormenting soldiers who had been sent away to war. They grew sick, insomniac, as visions of their hometown, their family, and their friends haunted them. Thus, nostalgia is a word stitched from two Greek roots, nostos meaning homecoming and algia meaning pain. This version of nostalgia was physical and deeply personal. But by the late 1800s, it became less a disease and more a romanticized term for memory, yearning, and reflection. Jean-Jacques Rousseau described nostalgia as the longing for a simpler, purer world. Nostalgia had become a symbol of resilience, anchoring the self through time. The separation of nostalgia as an emotion from a symptom of sickness laid the foundations for capitalist nostalgia. In the 1950s, American advertisers discovered the emotional power of wistfulness. A nation was sold comfort through vintage imagery, smiling families, simpler times, Americana. The past became commodified, comforting Americans feeling post-war, nuclear anxiety-driven melancholia. Crucially, this commodification of memory exists to fill the vacuum of collective amnesia. Fisher writes in Capitalist Realism that memory disorder provides a compelling analogy for the glitches in capitalist realism. Under neoliberal working conditions, characterized by precarity, short-term contracts, and constant restructuring, long-term memory is destroyed. Workers are forced to form an amnesia towards past working conditions and solidarity as a survival mechanism. Paul Connerton can extend this diagnosis to modernity itself, as he writes in How Modernity Forgets. Collective memory is sustained not simply through conscious recollection, but through social practices, institutions, and places. Capitalism's continual drive towards flexibility, mobility, and planned obsolescence dissolves these sites of continuity, producing a society increasingly unable to situate itself historically. Late capitalism, as it weakens historical memory, this allows people to forget the material and political realities of the past, producing an unusual temporal contradiction. While capitalism endlessly resurrects fragments of the past as consumable images, it simultaneously erodes the memory necessary to understand that past. We become nostalgic without remembering. What consumer capitalism achieves with nostalgia is strikingly similar to what reproduction achieved with art. Just as the endless reproduction of an artwork dissolved its aura by severing it from its unique existence in time and space, the endless reproduction of nostalgic symbols as opposed to real history dissolves the aura of memory by severing it from lived experience. Nostalgia's original value lay in its intimacy and singularity. Under consumer capitalism, however, nostalgia gains value only insofar as it can be displayed, shared, and ultimately profited from. The past is packaged into marketable aesthetics and distributed endlessly across advertisements, film, fashion, and social media. This result is politically significant and why we are seeing a rise in reactionary politicians. Benjamin believed this detachment of aura from art would transform it into a highly effective tool for mass psychological influence and propaganda. This is because art has lost its ritualistic purpose, and the vacuum created of its social role was shifted to politics. In the same sense, as nostalgia has become less about personal experience and rather the emotional comfort of recall, it can be wielded for political mobilization, precisely what we are seeing today. If culture provides the symbolic resources through which people make sense of the world, then a society increasingly oriented towards recycled pasts will inevitably produce a politics similarly oriented towards restoration rather than invention. Make America Great Again, Restore UK, and the concept that one must take their country back from immigrants, elites, and the woes of modern liberalism alike. These are all examples of how discourse today is focused on history, or an emotional history, rather than a normalization of the present or an embrace of alternative paths. We often call this rising social phenomenon across the Western world conservatism, yet a more precise term would be reactionaryism. A conservative is one who is opposed to rapid, radical change, while a reactionary is one who believes we must restore a previous state of society. They heavily overlap, but are not quite the same. To illustrate my point, philosophically conservative scholars I have met in my life focus on upholding current systems of capitalism, not just by name but by practice, and believe in things like gender and queer individual rights. These are positions that contrast starkly to what we today imagine as the average conservative. These ideologues seek not to conserve globalization, rule of law, democracy, and other such institutions, but actively oppose them, directly and indirectly. This is not to say the sentiment to the left is not nostalgic. We often hear liberals crave when things were normal, Obama, Roe v. Wade, and a time of stability more generally. Not to mention Walter Benjamin's famous term left melancholy, describing left-wing intellectuals who choose the emotional comfort of mourning past failures over active political engagement. Importantly, Benjamin further noted that the detachment of aura from art could have gone two ways. The first, which is what ended up happening, is the aestheticization of politics. Fascist political figures, through mass media, offer the public not rights or democracy, but rather illusionary expression. He specifically writes that fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. Essentially, fascists wield artistic spectacle to keep masses occupied and feel a sense of achievement, while in reality keeping structures unchanged. We can similarly understand the utilization of nostalgia for political means as an attempt by leaders to provide a sense of progress even if it is stagnant. Nostalgia is no longer but the reality of lived history. Instead, it serves as emotional comfort, a catharsis of sorts. It gives followers a shared narrative to rally around. This ties back to Fisher's thesis, the slow cancellation of the future. Modern-day politicians ironically present their ideology as almost progressive, a striving for a visionary future that nevertheless provides the comfort, familiarity, and stability of the past needed to navigate life through late capitalism. In reality, it is a static form of progress. It serves to lock the current wealth and power systems in place that created such alienation in the first place. In a time of anachronism, the future has disappeared. Where there is no future, there is only an idealized concept of the past and the present from which we can create objects that resemble the new. Aristotle once wrote that memory is neither perception nor conception, but a state of affection of one of these, conditioned by a lapse of time. There is no such thing as memory of the present while present, for the present is object only of perception and the future of expectation, but the object of memory is the past. All memory, therefore, implies a time elapsed. Consequently, only those animals which perceive time remember, and the organ whereby they perceive time is also that whereby they remember. But in a society where time is psychologically frozen, while personal memory remains, collective memory emerges from nowhere, instead imposed upon the subject for political leverage. As nostalgia is depoliticized, it paradoxically becomes so potent to politicization. Instead of being obsessed with sanitizing the past and present, we must embrace the dysfunction inherent to late capitalism, rather than use a vague golden age as an anesthesia for pains. Benjamin did not believe the aestheticization of politics was inevitable. His other path, the politicization of art, could provide us with more optimism towards the future of nostalgia. He believed mass-produced works could have equally been used to educate the public, spark critical thinking, and destroy traditional institutions. It just wasn't. Likewise, while nostalgia could have been a powerful tool for reflection and improvement on contemporaneity, capitalism, by offering consumers fragments of an idealized history for purchase, transformed nostalgia into a mechanism for coping with it. We are invited not to recover what has disappeared, nor to question why it disappeared, but merely to consume its image. Fisher emphasized this too. He utilizes the concept of ontology to look back in order to move forward. He argues that we must return to past eras, specifically the 1960s through the 90s, to unearth the alternative futures that were dreamt of but ultimately crushed by neoliberal economics. Hauntology being a mix between haunt and ontology, meaning the persistence of elements from the socio-cultural past haunting the present. Recovering the future requires recovering the past as a history to be understood. Only then can nostalgia cease to be an instrument of stasis and become once again a source of political imagination. In a world where we are constantly bombarded with a relentless, 24/7 stream of information, data, and social media feeds, we no longer have the quiet reflective space required to step back and process what our era actually means. Culture cannot even articulate today because it is too busy reacting to the maelstrom of the neoteric past, let alone imagine a radical hereafter. People often say carpe diem, that we must seize the day, but perhaps what late capitalism asks of us is something far more arduous. To seize the future, before the sand from the hourglass hardens to glass and transforms the ephemerality of time into something forever stationary.